To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Over 40 years ago, Susan Schwarz was found bound and shot to death inside of her own Washington home. At first, the police suspected this was somehow a robbery gone wrong. But over the years, that theory fizzled out, and they began looking at someone very close to the victim. However, without any forensic evidence linking him to the crime, would there be enough evidence to send an accused killer to prison? This is Forensic Tales, episode number 269, The Murder of Susan Schwarz. In the fall of 1979, Susan Schwarz was described by her friends as a sweet and a free-spirit person. And to her younger sister, Valerie, she was a role model. Even though Susan was much older than her at the time, she was still someone that Valerie looked up to. She was the perfect big sister. She listened, she cared, she protected Valerie just like a big sister should. Standing at barely 5 feet tall, Susan made friends easily. She was always walking around with a book in her hand, and she had no problem striking up a conversation. From everything I read about her for this episode, she was just a kind person who held the world in her hands. She had such a bright future ahead of her, but all of that was taken away one day in October 1979. October 22nd, 1979, Alderwood Manor, Washington, a place about 16 miles north of Seattle. Susan's boyfriend at the time comes home from work to find his girlfriend dead on the floor and immediately contacts the sheriff's office. Within minutes, the police arrived at Susan's home, and once they got there, this is what the scene looked like. The home itself wasn't very big. From the outside, it just looked like a regular home in the neighborhood. You wouldn't even know that anything was wrong. But once you got inside, that's when you knew. Susan was found lying in the middle of her bathroom floor. Her hands were tied behind her back with some type of electrical cord, and she was completely naked. She also had a black bra wrapped around her face and mouth like it had been used as a gag. Almost instantly, the police suspected she'd been shot in the head. There was a pillow next to her that had some blood on it, and there was a bullet hole that went directly through it. It was like whoever did this got the pillow, put it over Susan's head, and shot her. Maybe like it was used as a silencer. Besides the blood on the pillow, there was also a good amount of blood on Susan's face and the floor around her. All of this forensic evidence painted a picture for investigators. Someone broke into Susan's house, tied her up, bound her hands behind her back with electrical tape, used her bra as a gag and put it inside of her mouth, then used a gun to shoot her execution style. By all accounts, this was a very brutal and vicious murder. The first theory detectives came up with was maybe she confronted a burglar who had broken into her home. But most burglars run away when they find out that someone is home. So why would this person bind her, gag her, and then shoot her? Sure, it's possible, but it's not something your typical burglar does. They usually just want to break in, steal what you have, and then get the heck out of Dodge. They don't want to commit such a brutal murder just to steal something. When investigators went through the rest of the home looking for evidence, there was something that caught their attention: 2 sets of shoe prints in the carpet. Susan's home had a very plushy carpet, making shoe prints stand out pretty easily. And when looking at the floor, the police found 2 very distinct sets of prints, one smaller and one much larger. But neither one looked like they came from the victim. When Susan's body was discovered, she was barefoot. She didn't have any shoes on. But these prints looked like shoe prints. So that meant to the police that they were probably looking for two killers, or at the very least, they were looking for two different suspects with two different size shoes. Detectives went through the rest of the house, but they didn't find much evidence. There weren't any suspicious fingerprints, not even on the windowsill. There was virtually nothing. There weren't even signs of a forced entry. There also didn't appear to be much stolen from the house, maybe just a couple $100 worth of stuff, if that. So what kind of burglary goes wrong and then turns into a murder for barely a couple $100 worth of stuff? It just wasn't adding up. Plus, nothing looked ransacked. If this was a robbery, wouldn't the house be completely trashed and turned upside down? But it wasn't. The place was pretty clean. As a robbery seemed less and less likely, the police explored other possibilities, including this being over something personal. Maybe Susan knew her killer. This person felt comfortable enough to go to her house, bind her, gag her, and do everything else that they did. But why? Who would want someone like her dead, shot execution style inside of her own house? The first person the police looked at was the boyfriend, Bill Hassler. Not only was he considered suspect number one because he's the victim's boyfriend, but also because he was the one that discovered the body. That makes him a very interesting person that the police are going to want to speak to. But nothing about Bill Hassler stood out. He wasn't a very good suspect. For one, he was very emotional about Susan's death. Throughout pretty much his entire interview with investigators, he was crying and hysterical about what had happened. Later on, the detectives who spoke with him described him as being somewhat of a zombie the entire time. He didn't come across as someone capable of doing something like this. And two, he really had no motive. He loved Susan, and they were said to have a great relationship. But still, the police couldn't rule him out yet. He was the boyfriend, and he was the one that discovered the body. They had to keep him on the suspect list, at least at this point. So they kept digging and they kept looking. Could Bill Hassler seem innocent and distraught, but actually be guilty? Well, as the investigation went on, the police learned that he had an alibi. He was at work all day. Detectives even went to Bill's work and spoke with his supervisor, and there was no way that he could have left, committed the murders, and then came back to work without anyone knowing. So now Bill Hassler, the boyfriend, had to be officially ruled out. It wasn't him. Investigators canvassed Susan's neighborhood looking for any potential witnesses, and that's when they got another clue. One of her neighbors said they heard a squealing sound sometime around 9:45 that morning, and the sound came from Susan's house. Now, according to the neighbor, they didn't think about it much at the time. It didn't sound like a scream. It just sounded like a weird squealing sound. So the neighbor didn't do anything about it. Actually, they didn't think about it again until the police came knocking on their door. But interesting for investigators, that sound came at the same time they suspected the shooting took place, 9:45 that morning. Within a day of Susan's murder, a medical examiner performed her autopsy. On top of the single gunshot wound to her head, she also had multiple lacerations to the top of her head, like maybe she was attacked before she was shot. This seemed to paint another picture for investigators. The killer would have had to subdue her before tying her up. So they used some type of instrument to hit her over the head a few times. Also discovered at the autopsy was this. There were no signs of sexual assault. Even though she was found completely naked, she hadn't been sexually assaulted, so that couldn't be the motive either. She was found on her bathroom floor, so maybe she was showering at the time that she was attacked. As word spread about Susan's murder, people in the community were scared. How could this young, 20-something-year-old woman be killed like that inside of her own home? It made everyone feel on edge. especially without the police identifying any motive or suspects. It made people feel like they could be next. After detectives spoke with Susan's boyfriend, they turned their attention to her best friend, Karen Smith. If there was anyone who might know something, it would be her. So during this interview, the police learned something interesting. Karen had recently separated from her husband, Greg Johnson. The two separated because Greg was said to be abusive. And according to Karen Smith, Greg didn't like Susan very much because he felt like she was trying to get her to leave him. So, was that any type of motive for murder? Greg isn't a very good person. He blames Susan for his wife leaving him. Would that make him angry enough to do something like this? So a few detectives went over to Greg's house to speak with him. But he had an alibi. He said that on the day of Susan's murder, he was out fishing. He even gave the police the names of the other people that he was with that day. But here's the strange part. When the police spoke with these people that Greg provided them, they didn't remember him being there. They didn't say whether he was there or not. They just simply told investigators that they really didn't remember. So that's a little strange, right? So detectives weren't able to officially rule him out. He wasn't considered a suspect because they had no evidence suggesting that he was involved, but he definitely remained a person of interest. After that, Susan's case starts to lose steam. It had gotten to the point where all the leads dried up, suspects weren't there, the police had virtually nothing to keep investigating. So after 6 months, the case turned cold. It's now January 1986, over 6 years later, and there's been another murder that shares a lot of similarities. On January 17th, 1986, 28-year-old Molly Ann McClure was found murdered inside of her Seattle apartment. She had been killed at such a turning point in her life. She had just saved up enough money to afford this brand new apartment where she lived alone. She had just gotten a brand new job. She didn't even have a car because she wanted to make sure that she could afford this apartment. So she made sure that she lived close to the bus route. Molly was at a point in her life where things were really starting to take off for her, and that's when she was murdered. When Molly's body was discovered, she was lying on her stomach with her hands tied behind her back with electrical cords, just like Susan was. There was also a gag in her mouth, and she had multiple blunt force trauma injuries to her head. But unlike Susan's case, the police immediately identified a promising suspect, a guy named Sherwood Knight, Molly's upstairs neighbor. He lived in the building, and he had a pretty extensive criminal record. So detectives wondered, could Sherwood Knight have also killed Susan? They knew Molly and Susan had been killed in very similar ways. Both of them were attacked inside of their apartments. Both of them had their hands tied behind their backs with electrical cord, and they were both gagged. Now, the biggest connection. Sherwood Knight might have also known Susan. He was Greg Johnson's half-brother. Remember, Greg Johnson was Susan's best friend's estranged husband, the one who didn't like Susan because she tried to get her best friend to divorce him. So investigators had a suspicion that the two might have known each other. But that didn't mean the two cases were completely identical. From the autopsy, the police knew Molly had been sexually assaulted by her killer. Susan wasn't. Plus, Molly was killed 6.5 years later. That's a lot of time between the crimes to have been committed by the same person. On virtually the same day Sherwood Knight was arrested for Molly's murder, the police went to go speak with Greg Johnson again. The person they now know is Sherwood's stepbrother. And as it turned out, Greg Johnson was also in jail. He was in custody on robbery charges. However, this wasn't the first time he'd been to jail. He'd been arrested several times over the years for different crimes. This time, it just so happened to be robbery. So detectives spoke with Greg Johnson in jail, and this is what he had to say now, over 6 years later. He now said that on the day of Susan's murder, he was actually with his half-brother, Sherwood Knight. I guess he wasn't out fishing like he said he was years earlier. He said he and his brother were out driving around with a few other guys looking for a place to burglarize. He said that when they found a place, his brother Sherwood and a few of the other guys got out of the car, went inside, then came back out a little while later, and he said that Sherwood was holding a gun. He also said something like, this is Sherwood Knight, the half-brother. He said something like, "We better not get caught for this one." Now, later that night, Greg Johnson said he was watching the news when he heard about Susan's murder. So it seemed like Greg tried to implicate his brother in the crime. But still, Greg Johnson's word wasn't enough to press any charges against Sherwood Knight. To the police, both of these guys were criminals and definitely liars. So at this point, neither one was arrested in connection to Susan's case. Later that year, 1986, Sherwood Knight was convicted of Molly's rape and murder after trace evidence placed him inside of her apartment that day. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the highest available sentence at the time. But investigators still can't connect him or his half-brother Greg Johnson to Susan's murder. So the case turns cold again, but this time it turns cold for another 20 years. Throughout that time, Susan's family, especially her younger sister, were hopeful that they would eventually get some answers. But I think doubt naturally sets in after it's been so many years without getting closure and without getting justice. It's like you want to find the answers and you're hopeful about it. But as the years go on, and then eventually decades, you start to lose some of that hope. And I think that's exactly what happened to Susan's family. They remained hopeful, but I think they were also realistic. The chances of solving a 20-year-old cold case aren't always that great. Fast forward now to February 2005, 26 years after Susan's murder. The police up in Washington had recently formed the cold case team, a special unit within the police department whose goal was to solve some of the county's oldest cold cases. So as soon as Susan's family heard about this, they approached them asking them if they would consider Susan's case. So the cold case team agreed, and Susan's case had always been one that had haunted the department. So when her family approached them about the possibility of reopening it, this cold case team said absolutely. Back in 1979, when Susan was murdered, over 100 pieces of evidence were collected. Many of those items were thought to contain DNA, like her clothing. But back in 1979, there was no such thing as DNA testing. So all the police could really do was collect the evidence and hope that somewhere down the road it could be retested or tested to begin with. But now, in 2005, DNA testing was becoming a pretty common practice in criminal investigations. So everything that had been collected was sent to the cold case team to be tested for DNA. But here's the bad news. Nothing was found. All of the DNA collected from the evidence all belonged to Susan, the victim. No other foreign DNA was found at this time. So, you might have already guessed it, the case went cold again. Another 2 years went by, and it's now 2008. Karen Smith, Susan's best friend, got a phone call from Greg Johnson and Sherwood Knight's mother, saying that she got a letter she thought she would want to know about. It was a letter written by Sherwood, and it was addressed to his brother Greg while he was in prison serving his life sentence for murdering Molly. In part, it read, "You are supposed to help me out while I'm stuck here in prison. But if you don't help me out in the next 2 weeks, I'm going to tell everyone what you did." Here's the backstory. At the time Sherwood wrote this letter to his brother, he was experiencing some pretty serious health issues. He was likely going to die in prison. So Sherwood wrote Greg saying, "Hey, I don't want to die in prison, so you better send me some money so I can go out and hire a good attorney to fight this murder conviction. You need to help me, and if you don't, I'm going to tell everyone what you did." So when their mom found out about this letter, she picked up the phone and called Karen Smith, her former daughter-in-law. Karen took the letter and handed it over to the police. She said she thought the crime that Sherwood was referring to might be Susan's murder. Maybe Sherwood was trying to blackmail his brother into giving him money while in prison in exchange for keeping his mouth quiet about his involvement in Susan's murder. Sure, this looked like a viable theory, but what if Karen was wrong? Nothing about the letter said what Sherwood was talking about. It was all very secretive and very cryptic. Was he talking about Susan's murder? Or was he talking about a completely different crime that Greg Johnson may have committed? We already know that these two brothers aren't exactly your most upstanding citizens. When the police received the letter, detectives weren't sure what to do with it at first. Again, nothing about the letter was incriminating. Sherwood didn't specify what crime Greg Johnson might have committed. And it certainly didn't mention Susan specifically. It was all very vague. But still, the police knew that they had at least try to get more information. If they were wrong and the letter had nothing to do with Susan, that was fine. They could all move on. But if it did, then maybe they were on to something. This was a very big deal for Karen Smith. Greg was her ex-husband, and Susan was her best friend. She never came right out and said that she thought her ex-husband could have killed her best friend, but it was always in the back of her mind. She knew Greg was abusive and violent, and she knew that he blamed Susan for the end of their marriage. Susan always told Karen how she deserved to be with someone much better than him. She even helped Karen get out of the house when she finally decided to leave him and divorce him. So when Karen got the letter, she was scared. She wasn't even sure that she would turn it over to the police because she didn't know what Greg would do if he found out. So she kept the letter, for about 6 months before finally deciding to mail it to the police, which they were very glad that she did. The letter seemed to put Sherwood and Greg back on top of the suspect list, and that's when things in Susan's case got moving again. In 2009, the police in Washington heard about something very interesting and unique that a detective in Florida had started doing. He created a deck of cold case playing cards and put them in several different prisons. So think of a regular deck of playing cards. But instead of just being normal cards, they had pictures of homicide victims on them. So for example, the King of Spades card might have an unsolved murder from years earlier. It would have a picture of the victim on it, a short description of their case, and a phone number for inmates to call any tips. So this detective in Florida created a deck of these cold case playing cards and decided to put them in the prisons so that the inmates could play with them. As a result, they solved about a half dozen cold cases. Here's how. The decks were put into prisons, and on the back, there was a phone number for Crime Stoppers and a line that said, reward money would be offered for any tips leading to an arrest. So when inmates saw these cards and thought they had information about the case, they would call in a tip. And if they were right, they got a lot of money for it. It was a brilliant idea. Solve cold cases while basically incentivizing inmates to turn over information. It was a win-win. The police get the information they need to solve the case, and the inmate who calls in the tip gets a lot of money. So after hearing about the success this was having down in Florida, the police in Washington decided to create their own deck of cards. And one of those cards has Susan's case on it. She was the Queen of Hearts. Over the next 2 years, these cold case playing cards were circulated throughout Washington's prisons. And by 2011, those cards landed in the prison where Sherwood Knight was housed. In April 2011, 30 years after Susan's murder, Sherwood was playing with cards with a few other inmates when he ran across one that had Susan's picture on it, the Queen of Hearts. On the front, it said unsolved homicide, Susan Schwarz, 26-year-old female. If you have any information, call 1-800-222-TIPS. Caller does not need to give their names. As soon as he saw the card, he recognized the name and her photo, so he went to the nearest prison phone and called the tip line. He told the person who answered that he had information about Susan's murder. According to Sherwood, he was fishing on the pier when his half-brother, Greg Johnson, drove up. This was on the day of Susan's murder. Greg approached him saying, hey, if the police come by and speak with you, you need to tell them that I was out here fishing with you all day. Sherwood apparently asked his brother why, and Greg responded with, because I'm the one who murdered Susan. Sherwood also said that there was a woman sitting in the front seat of Greg's car. It was his girlfriend at the time. So the police tracked down this old girlfriend and wanted to speak with her immediately. She was now essentially the star witness. If she was in Greg's car on the day of Susan's murder, then what might she know about the crime? This woman, whose identity remains anonymous from what I could find, told the police that she was 17 when she met and started dating Greg Johnson. She said he was very abusive and violent toward her, but she never worked up the courage to leave. She was just a teenager. Her father had died about 9 months earlier, and her family was still having a very tough time dealing with the loss. So with Greg Johnson's encouragement, she became alienated from her family and moved in with him. Again, she was just 17. She was a kid. He would often threaten her if she ever thought about leaving him, and he was even allowing his friends to abuse her. This sounds like the person we know, Greg Johnson. Karen Smith, his previous wife / Susan's best friend, said virtually the same thing. He was abusive and violent. That was the very reason why Susan was trying to convince her friend to leave him. So when the police found out that this woman was possibly with Greg on the day of Susan's murder, they wanted to speak with her. They said they had some questions for her about a crime that was committed sometime while she and Greg were together and dating. That crime being the murder of Susan Schwarz. At first, she denied everything. She made it seem like Greg had nothing to do with it. So detectives turned up the heat. They said that 2 sets of footprints were found at the crime scene, and neither one of them matched the victim. So they knew they must have come from the killer. 2 people were inside of Susan's house that day. So they asked the woman for 2 things, a DNA sample and an impression of her feet. They told her it was so that they could rule her out from ever being inside of Susan's home that day. And as soon as they said that, this woman's demeanor completely changed. When the police first showed up, she was fully cooperative and even talkative with them. But as soon as they asked for a DNA sample, she flipped. She got up from the table and didn't really want to speak with them anymore. So one of the investigators asked her, "Were you there?" Now, at first, she didn't say anything. So we asked her again, "You were there at Susan's house that day, weren't you?" And that's when she said yes, she was there at Susan's place with her ex-boyfriend, Greg Johnson. After that, this woman proceeded to tell the police everything. She said Greg told her he needed to go for a ride to go see someone, so she went with him. Greg had told her this person owed him money and drugs. She said they went to a house and he went inside. A few minutes later, he came back out and said that a woman was taking a shower, so she needed to go into the house with him. So she did. She said that once they got back inside, Greg told her to grab certain things out of the house and bring them back to the car. So she did. She waited inside the car for a while, but Greg still didn't come back out. She said that she was worried that Greg might rape this girl because she was taking a shower and she was obviously alone and obviously naked. So she got out of the car and went back inside the house. And that's when she saw Greg pulling Susan out of the shower and beating her with the gun that he had. She says Greg forced her to the ground and used a piece of electrical cord to tie her hands behind her back. Next, the murder. This woman said she watched as Greg put the pillow over her head and pulled the trigger. And as he did it, he said something like, "This is what happens when you mess with me." She didn't know what this woman had supposedly done to Greg, but she knew it must have been something bad for him to come to her house and shoot her like that. Greg also told her to never say anything about what she saw, because if she did, the same thing would happen to her. So that's why she kept this a secret for the last 30 years. She said she was afraid of Greg Johnson. Almost this entire woman's story lined up with the evidence. She said Susan was taking a shower when they broke in. That explains why she was naked but hadn't been raped. Greg bound her hands with electrical cord. Electrical cord was found around Susan's hands. There was a bloody pillow found near her body. Greg used it as a silencer. And barely anything was stolen from the house. This murder wasn't about a robbery. It was about revenge. Finally, the 2 sets of footprints found from the carpet. One set belonged to Greg, the shooter, and the other belonged to the girlfriend. After hearing this woman's story, the police immediately went out and started looking for Greg. They had suspected him all along, but now they had a witness who said that they saw him kill Susan, so they wanted to track him down immediately. The police got their hands on Greg's last known Seattle address and went there to speak with him. At first, he was fully cooperative and agreed to chat with them. He didn't seem like he had anything to hide. He was once again cool, calm, and collected with them. So detectives once again asked him if he had anything to do with Susan's murder. Not surprisingly, he said no. But that was okay. The police felt like they had enough information, even without a confession, to arrest him, and that's exactly what happened. Greg Johnson was finally put in handcuffs and charged with Susan's 1979 murder over 30 years earlier. But here's where things got tricky from an evidence perspective. The prosecution had next to nothing. They had no forensic evidence proving that Greg Johnson murdered Susan that day. The only piece of forensic evidence found at the crime scene was the footprints. Is that really enough to convict someone of murder? It's not DNA or blood, it's just footprints. Well, before the prosecution had to tackle that problem, Greg did something that a lot of people found a little shocking. He agreed to a plea. 3 decades after Susan was killed, Greg Johnson pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to nearly 25 years in prison. He wasn't going to fight the charges. He wouldn't even take it to trial for a judge or a jury to decide. For prosecutors, this was a huge victory. They knew they didn't have the forensic evidence, and if they took their chances and went to trial, they might have lost. And if they did, well, then a killer would be set free. So they didn't want to take their chances without the forensic evidence on their side. And as a result, Greg Johnson accepted a deal for second-degree murder. He was the one who murdered Susan all of those years earlier. But why? What was the motive? Well, to answer that question, you can ask Greg Johnson yourself. He killed Susan because she had convinced his wife, Karen, to leave and divorce him. So he went to her house that day, seeking revenge. He also brought his girlfriend with him, who would eventually leave her footprints at the crime scene and ultimately confess decades later. At the sentencing hearing, Greg Johnson showed zero remorse for his actions. He didn't regret killing Susan and said that she deserved what had happened to her because of what she had done to his marriage. The woman who came forward, Greg Johnson's ex-girlfriend, hasn't been publicly named, and she was never criminally charged for any crime. Even though she was inside of Susan's house and she witnessed the murder, the police chose not to charge her with any crime. If she hadn't told them what she knew, they might not have ever arrested Greg Johnson. Although she kept a secret for over 30 years, the authorities felt like she was still a very important asset to their case against Greg Johnson, the actual murderer. To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. To find out what I think about the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode sharing my personal thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you don't miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, consider leaving us a positive review. You can also support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Please join me next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. For a small monthly contribution, you can help create new compelling cases for the show, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs. For supporting the show, you'll become one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, please visit patreon.com/forensictales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Jerry M., Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley S., Alice B., Danielle D., and Savannah. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.